Anyway, so on we go. It's like 9:45, and it's time for our first review. Tell us something that's out there that we might be interested in.
So there's this series on Shudder. Are many of you familiar with Shudder? I imagine lots of horror fans are. Yeah, fine. Okay, so there's tons of good stuff on Shudder. So there's this documentary series, 4-part documentary by Brian Fuller called Queer for Fear, which is basically looking at the history of LGBTQ plus issues in horror and arguing that actually that's kind of the source of most of what we think of as being great horror. So the contributors go from, well, on the one hand, you get filmmakers and you get fans and you get actors and you get drag artists. So you have, on the one hand, Karen Kusama, and then Mark Gatiss, who, of course, is, we all know very good. And then there's a drag queen whose name is Alaska Thunder. Which is not a name we probably... I'm sorry, that's the name. There's nothing I could do about it.
Carry on.
Yeah, exactly.
Song.
So the first episode looks at the birth of Gothic fiction and argues that the literary genre was created by writers who either were in the world of or were aware of LGBTQ. So here is a clip from episode 1 of Queer for Fear.
My favorite part of Frankenstein is that Mary Shelley was queer, because as many historians love to argue against, we have written texts from Mary Shelley to her friend saying that she likes to get tousy-mousy with women.
April 8th, 1825. When I return to Italy, I shall not come without my Jane, who is now necessary to my existence almost. Girl, she's not going without Jane, so don't even ask.
And in a way, kind of that's the tone of the doc, is that it flits between being, on the one hand, sort of taking its subject quite seriously, and on the other hand, being theatrical and camp and funny and entertaining. It goes from there on to Bram Stoker's Dracula, James Whale's career, which is really, really fascinating, Oscar Wilde's Portrait of Dorian Gray, which it discusses in terms of, hidden identities. And then onto archetypes like werewolves and aliens as being essentially stand-ins for queer characters, and then onto lesbian vampires and deadly women and that sort of stuff. And having done a Secrets of Cinema with Kim Newman on horror cinema, in fact, in which we were kind of thinking, well, on the one hand, there is a chronology, but on the other hand, what you really have to do is you have to break it down into tropes, into sort of iconic characters. And they do the same thing here, but they do it really wittily. And it's done in a way in which they very quickly win you over to the films, to the series' central thesis, which is all of horror is about otherness. And, I imagine there's a good few horror fans in the audience tonight. Anyone who ever grew up loving horror knows that the more you feel you don't fit, the more you feel outside of the norm, the more horror kind of chimes with you. And therefore, it's not surprising that so many people who have been othered by society feel that horror speaks to them and that they identify with the monster. And that's why I think, people like Clive Barker became so interesting. And I certainly, as a spotty, awkward kid, growing up in North London, I loved horror films because they were my friends. I always considered them to be my friends. I always remember Guillermo del Toro saying that he made friends with the monsters under his bed. So I think it makes a really convincing argument that anyone who has ever felt othered in any way at all is drawn to the horror genre. And of course, LGBTQ plus audiences, writers, performers, directors will find in that space an area to do stuff that they weren't able to do in the mainstream. And it's funny, I mean, every now and then it becomes almost too flippant and you forget how serious it is. But the smart thing about it is that it's got a very weighty text to it, but you're never going to watch it for 5 minutes and not laugh and not find a clip that you hadn't seen before and not find somebody making interesting connections and interesting parallels. Anyway, Queer for Fear, it's on Shudder, well worth checking out.
Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as we enjoyed making it. While you're here, check out all the other videos because they're cool too, aren't they?
Yeah, and if you want to keep up to date with everything Kermode and Mayo's take, then check out our social channels.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
I mean, I would. I have done.
Excellent.